Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic. Let's do it. What moment ruined you, shattered you, or completely broke your heart? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was walking with my cousins about 14 years ago when we found what looked like an old, burned-out house. So naturally, being kids at the time and having no sense of self-preservation, we decided to explore it. Mostly it was just full of charred wooden crap and junk, but then one of my cousins found an entrance to a cellar outside. We busted the old rusted lock off the door and looked down inside. It was dark down there, and we didn't really have any reason to go poking around it. Plus, we were starting to get creeped out. So we kicked some dirt down into it and walked off. When we got about 15 yards away from the house, one cousin says he hears a noise. So we stop. And yeah, there was a noise like somebody coming up the rotting cellar stairs of the house. We peek back through the trees and see a dark kind of fuzzy shape crawl out of the cellar, which we left open. It looked kind of like a big old dog. And then it stood upright. We hauled effing asses out of there. We all ran off in different directions like morons, each of us convinced whatever the cellar thing was chasing us. I ran right through some bars in a panic and tore my arms and legs all up, which got me in trouble when I got home. We were all fine otherwise, but we did avoid going that far back into the woods after that for a long time. The closest thing I can figure is there was a small black bear living in the cellar. Maybe it had another entrance we didn't know about, and we woke it up being little assholes. But seeing something hairy and dark come out of the cellar and then stand up was like being in a horror movie. I never want to see that old house again. When I was in the Navy, I saw a UFO. A lot of people will tell me no, it was just some weird lights, but nothing created on planet Earth moves the way this did. It was just getting dark outside, underway at about 10 knots in the Mediterranean. Dead flat seas. I'm sitting watching up on the Bright Bridge console when I noticed a single point of light in the air to me. It's what looks like a helicopter hovering above one of two merchant vessels in sight. I check the AIS and get the names of the two vessels and relay that information over to our TIC IDS. It's not incredibly uncommon for a merchant vessel to have a helicopter on board, but there's absolutely no signal coming from the bearings I was given, and no record of either ship having a helicopter. At this point, I started to get more concerned and curious. The point of light is still hovering above one of the ships. I hurried out to the port bridge wing and get on the big eyes, high-powered mounted binoculars, to see if I can get a better look at the aircraft. It appears to be at least 11 nautical miles away. And even with the magnification, all I can see is a single point of light. At this point, the OOD is interested and joins me on the bridge. And we watched this point of light zip 15 nautical miles in a matter of 2 to 3 seconds and stop directly over the other merchant vessel. There was no wind-up acceleration. It just went from hover to full speed to full stop instantly. The officer standing with me was completely speechless and in awe at what just happened and called for a higher power air radar search on that vector. Still nothing at all. The point of light hovers above the ship for a minute or so, then at about half the speed before, flies to a point between the two vessels and open ocean. It makes 3 to 4 dips down to the water and then back up at about 10,000 feet. Then it started to make an infinity loop pattern in the sky. It was dropping from around 10,000 to 2,000 feet and back up at an incredibly rapid pace. No human-made aircraft is capable of this amount of precision, acceleration, deceleration, or speed. Before the two of us could even react, the craft blasted across the sky at a slightly upward angle, completely silently, leaving no trail or trace at thousands of miles an hour before disappearing into the open sky. The officer of the deck, standing next to me, had his mouth wide open, eyes practically bugging out of his head behind the binoculars. He looked at me and said, Red Clam, what in the did we just see? To which I replied confidently, we just saw a UFO, sir. We reported it to the Commander-in-Chief as a glare on the windscreen of the bridge that we messed up, haha. But we know what we saw with our bare eyes. The two vessels involved got underway a few minutes after our report, each heading back toward the coast at 15 knots along the exact same track. I lost track of the vessels when I got off watch 4 hours later, but I've always been curious about them and where they ended up. I grew up in San Jose, California with my friends and had Jeeps. San Jose is surrounded by foothills. Well, we would trespass all the time. One time, we're in the middle of the Santa Cruz foothills on some flat parts of a hill, taking a piss. It's like 2 a.m., and we hear some lady singing in a weird language. And it went on for a bit, so my friend was done taking a leak. He's standing by the Jeep, and the small trees and bushes shake, and this younger woman comes walking through holding a baby, and she was rubbing the baby's head, all weird. I couldn't tell if the baby was alive, but she walked right past us like we weren't there. It was next level creepy. I grew up in Michigan before it was fashionable to kidnap the governor. Backpacking in the Pigeon River State Forest happened multiple times every year. On one fateful trip, we had closed down for the night. We were enjoying the campfire and listening to the night noises. Our campsite was up a bluff away from the river. I should mention that the experience was nicely enhanced by smoking the devil's salad. All of a sudden, we could hear something walking effortlessly through the water. We froze and looked at each other, eyes big as saucers, knowing our time had come. We quickly realized that whatever was moving through the water was not one but many. Certain that we were dinner for the whole family of Sasquatch, we did a military crawl to the edge of the bluff to identify our killer. Through the moonlight, we could see the elk head casually walking by the campsite as they headed to wherever they were going to bed down for the night. We watched in silence as those beautiful animals moved so graciously through the river. After they left, we walked back to our campfire and laughed uncontrollably as we tried to accuse each other of being the most scared that night. I think of that experience from time to time and smile from the memory. Thanks, OP, for bringing it to mind again. Not me, but my dad's coworker. Stretching the definition of work here, but I think it fits. Anyway, in the Vietnam War, this guy was part of a special forces outfit who were dropped into Laos or Cambodia to map the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Out of a group of about 20, only 3 or 4 made it out. At one point late in the operation, he was separated from the rest of his squad mates and was trying to find a river to follow back to a U.S. outpost. He said something they were always taught was to keep their rifle in their hands at all times and never set it down. After a few days of no supplies and avoiding Viet Cong, he hears the sound of rushing water and, as silently as he can, makes his way toward it. After coming through some trees, he finds a river that he recognizes and immediately has this mental celebration in his mind of, thank God I've made it, and in his haste to get some water in his dehydrated system, sets his rifle down. He said he was guzzling water when all of a sudden he hears this snapping sound like a branch cracking directly behind him. He said he immediately closed his eyes and prepared for a bullet to enter his skull. After a few seconds pass and he isn't departing the world to meet his maker, he opens his eyes and slowly turns around. 5 feet away, a Buddhist monk is standing in the middle of the jungle. The monk raises a finger to his lips and beckons him to follow. Turns out a monastery is nearby, and the monks were sympathetic to the U.S. They ended up sheltering him for a few weeks until they got him back to U.S. forces. Crazy enough, years later he ended up running into the same monk that saved his life at a remote Buddhist temple in the U.S. They remained friends until the monk passed away from cancer. I do mineral exploration in Alaska. I'm often transported by helicopters to very remote regions throughout the already very remote state. A few years ago, my field partner and I came across what seemed like a bear kill of a caribou carcass, but when we got closer it seemed odd. The only things that remained were 2 spines and 1 head. The head was arranged such that the mouth was wide open, pointing up like it was screaming toward the heavens. The eyes were cut out. Very weird. There's also been many instances of coming across old miners' builders littered with dog skeletons or having strangely nude children's clothing strewn about. I work in northern British Columbia doing bush grinding. My brother and I go in after logging companies and grind all the leftover piles of wood into trucks and take them to the mills for wood pellet. Back in February this year, we were on a night shift about 3 hours from the closest town, and the few locals that lived out there warned us about a pack of timber wolves that were about 25 strong and oddly fearless. It was about 3 in the morning, and we had worked our way down the block, rode about half a mile, and one of us needed to walk back to the pickup truck to bring it closer to fuel up the machines. Of course, I drew the short straw and went for a walk. Not even halfway up to the truck, the hair in the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was being watched, so I swung my flashlight beam across the tree line, and all the eyes watching me lit up. Of course, I left my shotgun in the truck, and I didn't think running was a wise idea, so I kept walking swiftly while focused on the tree line, watching the eyes follow me for the rest of the way back to the truck. I get to the truck fine, and obviously never left it too far away again. I've had many creepy and interesting encounters in the bush, but this one was definitely one of the oh shit moments.
I know it might just sound like words of a stranger, but it will get better. And had that relationship lasted, this sounds like it would have been an inevitability. So, in the moment, sucks. It will get better.
I was about 14 years old when my dad went away on the business for a couple of weeks, leaving me to tend to the farm by myself. Mostly just feeding horses and chickens, not a big deal. Farm was way outside of town and down a dirt road. Nearest neighbors were 2 pastures away, and my dad insisted on never locking the doors. After the first few nights, I started hearing tapping on the windows late at night, so obviously I broke Dad's rules and started locking the front and back doors. Then the window tapping advanced to doorknob rattling. And then I started finding odd things around the farm while doing chores. One morning, I found the horses stuffing themselves in the hay storage stall. The latch for the stall was very stiff and a little complicated, so it had obviously been opened by a person and not the horses. The worst morning, I stepped out on the back porch and found all the chickens sitting in a row along the side of the shed, evenly spaced, with their necks broken. 1 or 2 were still moving a bit. They looked set out on display. The chicken yard latch had obviously been opened by a person and left open. The worst part of all of this was when my dad finally came home, blamed me for every bit of oddness and disaster, and acted like I was stupid for being scared. He insisted that the horses opened the hay latch and that the dogs were responsible for the open chicken yard and line of posed, broken-necked chickens. I think it's worth mentioning that our next-door neighbor was well known for being batshit crazy, documented bits of crazy that my dad was entirely aware of, included putting bear traps in his haystacks to catch the kids who had been playing in it and blocking off a neighbor's driveway with a load of dirt as revenge for not letting him ride his horses on their property. So my guess is that shit crazy neighbor could see that my dad's vehicle was gone, could hear my music turned up in the distance across the pastures, and figured terrorizing a middle school girl would be a fun hobby for a couple of weeks. When I was 15 or so, I went fishing with a neighbor. We had to walk for an hour and then hike for 1 more hour or so through the forest. There was a creepy lake that had the surface covered by duckweeds. Anyway, the lake's pretty eerie. Old people were telling us stories about not having a bottom. We went there several times. Nothing bad happened, so we continued going there, being a popular fishing spot for some of the locals. Anyway, we stayed a little bit too much. Even though it was summer and there was plenty of daylight, we still had to go back through the thick forest. We were walking in a fast rhythm, so we could reach the road to the village in the daytime because we had a few more kilometers from there. In the middle of our journey through the forest, we were walking on a ridge, on both sides having some steep slopes with bushes and trees and a thick layer of leaves on the ground. Because of the thick vegetation, you weren't able to see more than several meters down. While walking and chatting, we both heard a noise from the right side. It was like someone was walking with us through the leaves from the bottom of the slopes. This went on for 1 or 2 minutes. If we stopped, that, whatever it was taking 2 or 3 more steps, and then it stopped also. At this moment, I was pretty frightened. We still had about 2 more kilometers to the road, and it was almost dark. The friend I was with was older than me, and he was used to the forest because he worked as a ranger in the past, so I was relying on his experience. We continued walking downhill on our route, and that thing was increasing the walking rhythm, shuffling through the dried leaves and bushes. At this point, it was almost dark in the forest. I look at my friend, he looks at me, pretty frightened, and he just tells me, "Run." Needless to say, we went full speed on the trail. The sound followed us for several more seconds, then we lost it. Until this day, I still cannot explain what the thing was. It was clearly something that was two-legged. In that area, we have bears, deer, wildcats, foxes, wolves, badgers, etc., but the walking, following behavior doesn't seem to match any of those. I used to work for a company that specialized in hazmat restoration and working in confined spaces. We traveled around the country depending on the type of contracts we had. We dealt with some pretty cool and sometimes creepy stuff. One that comes to mind was at a haunted Indian school. The story goes that it was run by Christians and that they had a tendency to lose Native American children. My boss had called me and a few others in one so we could pick our crews and go over the plans. Most of us already had people in our crews that we liked due to specific skills or because of their demeanor. This time, we were instructed to pick guys who could keep cool at all times, since this job wouldn't really need anything special. It was going to be demoed by another crew after we went in. We got a warning about the building. The boss let us know that people broke into it all the time to do crazy witchcraft stuff and to be careful of anyone who might reside in it, such as hobos, cultists, and ghosts, because it was supposedly haunted as spook. At the site, our radios would go off and sometimes we would hear someone talking. We thought it was interference. Our harnesses would get tugged on and no one was there. After a few times, I got to hear voices or people calling my name. I believe the place was haunted, and so did most of the guys. Several used to hold prayer circles before we went in, and a few refused to go in and would ask to be moved to a different job site, which we would do for their safety and ours. Quite a few things happened there, but nothing I can really call malicious, just really creepy. My dad told me a sea tale of his days working on ocean-going barges. He said one night they were underway with heavy seas and had to adjust the tie-up between the tugboat and the barge. Forgive my nautical blasphemy, I'm butchering these terms. He was the one with the time offshore. He described doing anything on deck at night in a storm as about the most dangerous thing you possibly could do, because outside of the weather and risk of going overboard, there was such high tension on various cables that if anything snapped, it might come across the deck and cut someone in half. Now, he said this particular seagoing tug had had some history. One of the previous crew had gone missing before Dad's time on the crew, and from the way it wasn't discussed but occasionally alluded to, there may have been foul play. So in the midst of the storm, with danger and tension high, an argument broke out. Two of the crew started yelling at each other, and at that moment that everyone thought it might come to violence, a fire axe flew across the deck and landed between their feet. No one was near the wall where it had been strapped down. A fire axe has its own bracket welded to a wall, with straps to hold it in place unless it's needed. They don't just come loose on their own, and the odds of it landing at their feet were impossible, except that the two arguing were also the ones who had fought with the lost sailor. They did not fight. They put the axe back in the rack. Everyone finished their work quietly, and it was not spoken of again until they returned to shore. I worked in an oil refinery for a while, and everyone told stories of this guy who would eat chips while taking a shit. I'm pretty skeptical by nature, and coupling that with the general level of effing around amongst my peers, I figured it was just a myth. But one night I'm working my 10th 12-hour night shift in a row, so I've had more than a few cups of coffee and find myself in dire need of a shit around 3 a.m. So I head into the old mobile shit trailer, think 30 feet double-wide trailer full of urinals and stalls. So there I am, pants, coveralls, and a couple of sweaters at my ankles, phone in hand, minding my own business, while I hear the door creak open and the shuffling of my feet and the rustling of coveralls, and someone pops into the stall next to me. At this point, I'm already thinking this dude is weird. There's 30 stalls, and he went into the one next to the one in use. But the weird level got turned up to 11 when I hear the telltale rustle of a chip bag. My brain instantly recalls the story of the chip shitter. I listen in disbelief as this fiend rips open his bag of munchies and digs in. The sound of that monster munching down potato chips while simultaneously unloading what can only be described as a crime against humanity into that toilet will haunt my nightmares until the end of my days.